My name's Stephen Kelly. I'm Chief Executive of Manufacturing Northern Ireland. I'm very pleased that we have the team from Trader Support Service with us today to look at a number of areas, particularly in and around those supplementary declarations and those issues that are coming towards us in the next couple of weeks. I can just say that this session will be recorded, and we'll be sharing a recording of the event probably tomorrow. We have already got a number of questions submitted in advance and after the presentations from Frank, Shanker and Dan. We'll be going through some of those questions that have already been submitted. But if you do have some questions, then please do use the Q&A function at the bottom, not the chat function, but the Q&A function at the bottom, and we'll try to get you as many answers as we can today. One request on the Q&A, it's very difficult to manage that process. So if you do have a question, please keep it as general and as simple as you can, bearing in mind that there's other people tuning into this and the answer may be relevant to them. We can't do individual business consulting over Zoom. It's pretty much impossible. So do keep your questions short and simple and as more general as possible so others can have the benefit of the answer to that question. I think we'll kick off now, and I think we're going to begin with Shanker Singham. Shanker, over to yourself.
Thanks very much. Sorry to get so immediately into the material here, but I'm just very conscious that we've got quite a lot to get through. So I'm going to start with a recap of the service, and I'll talk also about the transit service and GBNI via Ireland and what we're planning and product in the pipeline for Northern Ireland to GB via Ireland. Frank will focus on the consignment first model. I will come back in to talk about SFDs for controlled goods, which is part of our most recent release, and then Frank will talk a lot about supplementary decks, and we'll also cover the tariff options and the strategy that you'd be using as you make your supplementary declarations. So if we go to the next slide, please. So just again, quick recap, as Stephen just mentioned, actually, the TSS is not a personalized advisory service in the same way that you'd use an accounting firm or your law firm or customs intermediary, where you'd say, you know, I have no idea how to get my goods from GB to NI. Based on my fact pattern, tell me which customs facilitation I should be using. What TSS will do, it's a digital first service. It has to be very straightforward. It has to cover the core journey. Once you've identified what it is that you want to do, TSS will then enable you to do it. There are about 750 now people in the contact center, agents in the contact center. They are divided into 3 categories: tier 1s, who will handle your inquiries about registration, things like, I don't know what my password is, that sort of inquiry. Tier 2s, who have at least 2 years of customs experience, who will help with some of the how you enter information into the portals and those sorts of things. We also have tier 3s who are at least 7 years customs experienced, and we'll get into some of the more detailed questions. Again, not personal advisory services, but things that have more customs components, and that's the way to really use the contact center. TSS does not do, just to remind you, doesn't do things like export health certificates and some of the SPS certifications, controlled goods certifications, but we do training on that, and there's a huge amount of material, particularly on the SPS area. When we get to controlled goods or SPS controlled goods, we can talk to you about the different material that's available on the Northern Ireland Customs and Trade Academy website. And this is all partly because we're not intending to replace the services of the existing intermediary market. TSS is a temporary solution. It will go away after a couple of years, and at that point you need to have a functioning intermediary market in Northern Ireland to handle some of these processes. So we go to the next stage, the next slide, please. So this is just metrics as of Sunday, the 14th of Feb. So broadly speaking, what we're seeing is significant number of registrations of companies with TSS, that over 32, I think we're actually at 33,000 now. And a lot of those, probably 8,000 of those, have happened since January 1st. So that sort of tells us that the market is telling us that our service is working and declarations are being raised. And hence we've got probably about 25% increased take up of registrations. We had thought that we would have a certain number of registered companies by December 31st, and we'd be working with that universe, and that has not panned out in the way we thought. We've actually increased the number of registered companies, but we are getting really to the point where probably at the peak of the number of companies available. E&S declarations, that's the entry summary and safety and security declaration, the entry summary declaration. We're getting to a point where we're seeing about 31.6 thousand week on week, something of that sort of order of magnitude, suggesting over 170,000 created to date, and that does track to consignments. And the SFD declarations, the Simplified Frontier declarations, stabilizing at around 26,000 a week. Again, 133,000 for the period so far from January 1. And so we think around about 170,000 consignments created by us since the 1st of January. It very much is a digital first service. 60% of inquiries raised online. It's been 100% available. There's been quite a lot of media suggesting it's been down at specific times. That's not correct. And I don't know whether that's confusion with other services that exist out there, but it has been up 100% of the time, and calls get answered within 6 seconds on average. We are doing quite a lot of outbound calling to traders, and that's again something that we hadn't anticipated that we would be doing. We're doing those outbound calls to handle things that are related to our releases and so on. And then the final point that I made about the trader registrations growing. So we go to the next slide, please. And that's that shows you the pattern for the entry safety and security declaration. So you kind of see the sort of sinusoidal curve there, that you get a peak at around 1,800 in the middle of the week, and then you get a tail off at the weekends. If we go to the next slide. So quick recap on the process. As you know, our process basically has 3 sort of steps to it. 2 broad categories. One is the entry safety and security declaration, which is necessary because you're moving from one safety zone, safety and security zone, to another, from GB to Northern Ireland. That's based on the language of the Northern Ireland Protocol. That's the safety and security declaration. That's the declaration that Border Force are more concerned about. And then you have the Simplified Frontier Declaration, which is the first part of the import declaration. And the final part of the import declaration is the Supplementary Declaration. But the import declaration itself is both of those together. So if you only do the Simplified Frontier Declaration, then you haven't completed the import declaration process. If you haven't completed the import declaration process, then you're not compliant. You're not legally compliant. So these are legal requirements. What the TSS has done is separate these out into two processes, really to help traders get over the frontier in as simplified a way as possible, to get over the boundary between GB and NI in the most simple way that is possible. And so therefore we'd say that as we've launched the second release 2, which includes supplementary declarations, we'd say to the trading community, please work with us, please cooperate with us on getting the information to us so that we can raise a supplementary declaration on your behalf. This is not an optional extra. This is very much a legal requirement and part of the process. So if we go to the next slide, please. And this is the overall process. So you start off on the left-hand side there with a decision about who is doing what, and what are the trade terms between the supplier and the Northern Ireland, the GB supplier and the Northern Ireland importer. That brings in the Incoterms that you would use. The Incoterms, there are many different Incoterms. There's only one, delivered duty paid, where the obligation to do the customs declaration rests with the GB supplier, not the Northern Ireland importer. In every other case, it's the Northern Ireland importer that has to do the import declaration. But you can come to a decision with your haulier and your transportation company as to who's putting what information onto our portals, because the first thing that needs to happen is the carrier has to provide, or the carrier is responsible for the entry summary declaration, the ENS declaration. That's the safety and security declaration I mentioned. That is raised by TSS based on information provided by the, and it can be either haulier or the trader who provides this information, or some combination of both. But you need to agree, trader and haulier, who is going to do that, and who's going to put in what information. We'll take it from whoever can provide it. What we do with the safety and security declaration is that also generates in our system the simplified frontier declaration, and we then provide, TSS provides so far, the MRN for the carrier, the movement reference number. The carrier then takes that MRN and they populate GVMS, because GVMS, the Goods Vehicle Movement Service, TSS does not directly support. We train you on it, we talk about it, we explain it to you, but GVMS you need to do as a carrier yourselves. The carrier then gets from GVMS the GMR, the Goods Movement Reference number. That is the number that applies to the whole of the carrier's load, everything on the truck essentially. And it is that GMR that allows you to go through the ferry terminal. If you don't have a GMR, you cannot get through the ferry terminal. And that's why it's very important that you have MRNs for each of the consignments on the truck, which means you've got to have generated, or we have got to have generated on your behalf, an SFD for each of those consignments. If there's one consignment that doesn't have an SFD, there cannot be an MRN for that consignment. That means there cannot be a GMR for the whole truck. And that means the whole truck is not going to get through the port. And that's very important when we come to talking about the SFD for SPS controlled goods, where a lot of this information needs to be put on the a lot of the information you need in order to fill in the customs declaration needs to be put in at the SFD stage, not the supplementary declaration stage, which is the general case for non-SPS controlled goods. So once that's once you're cleared, you can transport your goods to the Northern Ireland premises. You complete your delivery, and then we will, as we've said in all of our previous presentations, we will come to you by the 4th day of the month after the movement. That's the general rule. To ask for extra information so that we can raise a supplementary declaration. It is at the supplementary declaration level or period that the decision is taken about what duties need to be paid, whether your goods are not at risk, whether they're at risk, all of those decisions, waivers that you can use to essentially it's a subsidy for the payment of those things. All of that applies at that stage. So if we go to the next slide, we have put in place, TSS has put in place, from GB to NI via Ireland, a transit process. And I want to just very quickly highlight what that is. Now, there are materials on transit. There's a webinar that was almost exclusively related to transit, and all of this information is on the NICTA website, and we can certainly share via Stephen all of the material that we've currently put up, so you can look at the webinar. I'm going to give you a quick thumbnail, few minutes on transit, but there was a whole presentation on it, and it's working, it's live, it's being used by people now. So the point to recognize is that as of the 1st of January 2021, haulier moving goods from GB to NI via Ireland could only do that in two ways because of the UK leaving the European Union. The two ways are to use transit, i.e. you move goods through Ireland, through a European member state, but they're going from one part of the UK customs territory, GB, to another part of the UK customs territory, Northern Ireland. So you can use transit to do that, or you can do a direct export to Ireland, which would be exactly like doing an export to any European member state. And you enter the goods in free circulation on the island of Ireland using the Northern Ireland Protocol, which says that there is free circulation of goods on the island of Ireland without checks or controls. So those are the only two ways. There is no other way of moving goods to Northern Ireland via the Irish ports. We don't support, TSS does not support the second option. That's a straightforward export to a European member state. I say straightforward, it obviously involves a lot of different customs and other documentation. The transit route is a lot easier, as I'll show. But if you are going to do that, number two, then you will need a separate customs agent to do it, to help you. If we go to the next slide. So why would you use the TSS Transit Service? Well, transit minimizes the paperwork that would ordinarily be associated with the counterfactual, which is that direct export to Ireland. You minimize the number of Irish customs processes you'd need to interact with, and you minimize paperwork because you're using the transit accompanying document, which is a transit document, as opposed to export declarations out of GB or import declarations into Ireland. So, and this is a quote from a very experienced former head of Dutch customs brokers. The Dutch are one of the leaders in the use of transit in Europe, and he's one of the leading authorities, and seemed to think that our process was a very simplified process. And so we certainly commend it to you. We think you should definitely use it. We go to the next slide. So what is required for this transit process? What do you actually have to do? What will TSS do for you? So the first thing that has to happen, because there is a movement from one safety and security zone, which is GB, to the Irish safety and security zone, which is the European safety and security zone. And so we will do the entry summary declaration into the Irish import control system, the Irish version of ICS. TSS will raise that for you when you initially enter the portal. When you enter the portal, you'll pick that NI to GB via IE route, and that will start the process in train. We will also do the entry into the NCTS system, which generates the transit documentation. The transit documentation is the transit accompanying document, the TAD, and TSS will generate that for you. That will be printed out at the office of departure, and that will be given to the driver. That's what the driver of the truck will hold with them. We will also do, as we do in the normal GB to NI core journey, the import declarations. We'll do the SFD, we'll do the supplementary declaration after the goods have arrived. You will be able to use, or rather your haulier will be able to use, the TSS transit guarantee to do all this. You ordinarily need a transit guarantee in order to use the transit process, because transit is concerned, or what you need to prove or essentially ensure, in a sense, through the guarantee, is that there's obviously a risk that goods will not make it into the final end jurisdiction, and that there's a risk that they will enter the European member state, Ireland in this case, in free circulation, and without paying the appropriate duties. So that risk is covered off by the transit guarantee, but we have one. So your haulier, if he doesn't have one, that you don't need to worry about that. They can use ours. We will also do the communications to UK Border Force. So that would be the initial communication to UK Border Force. That's done at the time of getting the TAD. And we'll do the final communication, which is at least 6 hours from the first communication, and that's part of the process that will close the transit properly. The other part of that process is the SFD and the supplementary declaration. Now you will need, or the haulier will need to do the PBN, the pre-boarding notification, to the Irish RoRo system, which is the Irish equivalent of GVMS, which functions as the Office of Transit in Ireland, which is part of what you have to do. It's a very straightforward process. If you look at our webinar on transit, we had the Irish Revenue Commissioners on there to walk you through the PBN system, and you'll see that it's an extremely easy process. Appreciate that from the beginning, a few weeks ago, there were some issues with PBN. Those issues have been resolved now, so there's no problem with using the PBN system. And secondly, what you will need to provide is if you are moving SPS controlled goods or excise goods or controlled goods in other areas, you will need to provide the additional certifications, licenses, the traces registration and so forth. And you will have to do that to the Irish authorities. And again, in the transit webinar, we actually showed all the, we had the Irish Department for Agriculture on the webinar, and they walked people through the what is required on the Irish side. And the important takeaway is that if you're a Northern Ireland importer, you can enter all of this information into the Irish traces system. And the only thing you need to do is make sure you're registered with the Irish system, but you do not need to be an Irish importer in order to do that. Again, under the protocol, Northern Ireland importer can do all this. We go to the next slide, please. So I guess I'll just cover this really quickly. This is the process, the transit process that we're using. So you enter GB NI via IE when you go to submit your ENS declaration on the TSS portal. You will then receive a transit template from us, which you complete and return. We will then send the ENS MRN and what's called the transit LRN, the local reference number. You seal the truck. You arrive at the Office of Departure. So if you're going to Holyhead, you arrive at the Road King facility close to Holyhead. You collect from there your TAD, and that's where you receive the MRN, the transit MRN. We will notify Border Force that the transit has begun. You submit the PBN to the Irish RoRo system, and then you complete the ferry crossing from GB to Ireland. You've now fulfilled the Office of Transit requirement in Ireland. So you can clear the Irish port and you can continue to your destination. And then you arrive at your destination. Either you'd be arriving at an authorized consignee location, which is part of the transit process. You have an authorized consignor and or an authorized consignee. And if you were doing that, your authorized consignee will end the transit on NCTS, and they'll contact us and tell us the goods have arrived, and we'll finish the rest of the process. Or you can, and this is the state at the moment, you can remotely close. You can go straight to your point of unloading, provided you've not heard from Border Force within that 6-hour period I referred to. That isn't, technically that is an Office of Destination closing. Border Force may contact you in the 6-hour period. They may say, we want to inspect the goods. This happens very rarely. At the moment, I think there's probably about 10% of people who are using this who have been contacted by Border Force, and they'll tell you where to take the products, take the goods, or take the truck. And it will either be Belfast, Larne, or Warren Point if they ask for that. But as I say, 90% of the cases, you don't hear anything from Border Force. You go straight to your point of unloading and you unload the truck. And then we will come back to you with the import declaration process culminating in the supplementary declaration by the 4th working day of the following month. And it's the SFD, the initial import declaration, and the Border Force notification will close the transit movement. So if we go to the next slide. It's one quick thing. If you are moving SPS control goods, then they do need to have the appropriate certificates, the export health certificate and so on. You do need to do your traces NT registration and get the correct CHED form, because you need the CHED to put into your import declaration. and that'll need to go, as it would in a GBNI movement of SPS controlled goods, that will have to go into the Simplified Frontier Declaration. And the goods would be checked, potentially could be checked at the border control post in the Irish port of entry. From an SPS standpoint, you are actually, what you're doing is basically the same as entering Ireland from an SPS standpoint. The only other thing I would say about this process is that if you are registered on the UK Trader Scheme, and just to be emphasize the point, UK Trader Scheme is incredibly important. It's what will allow you not to worry about rules of origin, not to worry about paying a tariff. If you are registered, and we're in the final week here, the registration process ends on February the 28th. So you must get your registration in by February the 28th for the provisional authorization, which is what I would suggest you all need to get if you're covered by that. Just because you're using the transit route does not mean you lose that ability to benefit from the UK Trader Scheme. You can still benefit from the UK Trader Scheme even where you're using transit. So we go to the next slide, please. So wanted to talk to you about a product that we are developing. We currently, if you're moving goods from NI to GB via well, either via Ireland or directly, you can obviously move them directly, and we support that. Or you can move them from Northern Ireland to GB via Ireland as an indirect export. And there are 2 points here. One is we will support the current movement, which is NI to Ireland, and then an export as if it is an export out of Ireland. We will do those requisite declarations for you in those particular cases now, but we are developing a more simplified way of doing NI to GB via Ireland. It is, in customs language, it is called an indirect export, but it involves port of exit, the Irish port, and port of export, the Northern Ireland port. So customs regards it as an NI to GB export, but a exit out of the Irish port, and that is much simplified, and we will be developing that very shortly, and we'll make people aware that it exists. Of course, the other opportunity, the other thing you could do is transit from NI to GB via Ireland, the sort of reverse transit from what we had discussed before. TSS will not support that. The reason why we're not supporting that is because it's related to the Northern Ireland Protocol itself, which says that any NI to GB movement, there's no control, there's no export declaration, there's nothing, unless you are moving goods in duty suspension. Since transit is a movement in duty suspension, we would have to do an export declaration, and we would have to do the transit documentation. And I think what you've seen from the transit documentation is it's very simplified because you don't need the export declaration piece. So it's not really a very simplified route if you have to do both. And that's why we're actually much more focused on getting people to use the first 2 of those journeys. We go to the next slide. And so this is essentially just a recap on NI to GB via Ireland, what we're going to be putting in place. So for example, if you look at the Dublin Holyhead route, you would have to do a indirect export declaration into CDS. So again, Northern Ireland is the place of export, Ireland is the place of exit. That would be an export declaration, as you'd have to do if you were moving goods in duty suspension directly between Northern Ireland and GB, or you were in one of the 14 treaty areas. TSS will provide the export declaration movement references. The trader or the haulier will again create the PBN on the Irish Railroad system, which is part of that. It's the only other requirement that you need to do with the Irish systems. If you do that, then you should be able to move the goods into GB. And we're working with relevant authorities in the UK to lower the incidence of other requirements that might apply to this particular route, so we can make it easier for traders to use it. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I'm going to ask Frank now to talk about consignment first, which is a option. We listened to the groupage industry in particular, groupage hauliers in particular, who expressed some concerns about our systems in terms of how they work with groupage. And we came up with this mechanism, which is now in place and which Frank is going to talk you through.
Thank you, Shanker. And let me go to the next slide and I'll talk through. So I'll use the diagrams rather than the words. So the way the first release of TSS worked is the requirement to move goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland is essentially an import process. So there are two elements that Shanker mentioned: an entry safety and security declaration and a simplified frontier declaration. The entry safety and security declaration is essentially something that the haulier performs, or the carrier, and that contains detail of the vehicle journey. So we've got, that's the top line there, vehicle and itself, and the vehicle journey details. So what day are you moving the goods, what ports are you using, where you're going from and to. Then the simplified frontier declaration is a statement of what goods are in the vehicle itself, and that consists of a header, which is detail about who the buyer and the seller are, so details of who's buying from who, and a summary of what those declarations are. And then there's a list of the items associated with that consignment. So three types of records go into the process on TSS, and we use the header record there to create the ENS declaration on behalf of the haulier, and then we use the consignment and item details to create the simplified frontier declaration on behalf of the buyer or the seller. And the process in the first release of the TSS system is linear, so you have to create a header, so you've got to know which truck you're using, what journey you're taking, and then you put consignments records onto that header, and then you put the items into those consignments. So and that works very well for some organizations who can plan ahead, and they have particular loads and particular configurations that allow them to build their consignments for a particular vehicle with enough notice. But it doesn't work particularly well for some organizations who start with consignments first, and then once they've created a manifest, they'll decide which vehicle is taking that group of consignments. We came up with the consignment first model, which looks a bit like this. So in this instance, the buyer or the supplier, depending on the Incoterms, in this case it's the trader 1 and trader 2, they'll create the consignments. So trader 1 could be Acme Paint Company, and they will create a consignment saying, I'm going to move these paint products from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. So there may be an order for a certain quantity of paint. They'll create that consignment on their TSS record on their account, and they'll then add in the tins of paint and the paintbrushes and whatever commodities are associated with that consignment, with that order. So they can build up a range of consignments depending on the orders, and they'll just build those up on their TSS account. Trader number 2, so this might be a table manufacturer or somebody, as an example. They equally are getting orders in, and they are doing the same thing, creating their orders on the TSS system on the consignment first model, and they're just entering those consignments. So a consignment being essentially an order between trader number 2 and the buyer, and they're listing the items that go onto that consignment. So 2 tables for that particular purchaser creates a consignment, and they can quite happily create these consignments on their records, as many as they like, in advance, and what they can't do is submit them to create a declaration. So they'll just sit on their account as a consignment. What happens next is they'll decide who is actually going to transport those goods. So typically they might put them in on Monday, and then ask and phone the haulier and arrange, can we get these out Wednesday or the next convenient date, etc. And once they've agreed that, they will then assign that consignment to the haulier. So freight organization, whatever they may be, will accept that. And in order to do that, all the trader has to do is put the EORI number of their preferred carrier into the carrier field. And we'll see how that works in the video in a moment. And that will transfer the consignment over to the haulier. The nice thing about this process as well is for certain goods, you need to put down the pricing of the items that you're asking to be transferred. In this model, the pricing doesn't go across to the carrier, so that the confidential information can be kept just for the trader themselves. So from a carrier's perspective, they'll now be seeing these records, these consignments arrive on their list, and they will be able to decide which of those consignments go on which lorry, and when they're ready, they can create a header record for that particular journey, assign the consignments to them, hit the submit button, and it will create the declaration for the safety and security for the vehicle and the simplified frontier declaration for those consignments. And just to bring that to life, we've got a short video, a 5-minute video, that will show how that process works and bring it to life a bit more. In order to do that, I've got to switch over to Shanali to present. So if I can stop sharing my screen. How do I do that?
I'll take over, that's fine.
Can you manage that, or do I need to stop sharing?
I think that's okay. Let me know when you can see it.
Yeah, got it.
Oh, I can't make it quite full screen, which is a bit annoying.
Welcome to this overview of the Trader Support Service and how to raise a declaration starting at the consignment level. Navigating down the page will take you to the declaration section. And you can see we now have an option to start that entry summary declaration at the consignment level. Now an option section. And you can see we now have an option to start that entry summary declaration at the consignment level. Selecting this option opens the new form. And because this particular consignment is not already linked to an existing entry summary transport level, the client job reference number is not actually visible to us here. There are some additional fields on this form. We have the carrier EORI, and once all the goods have been added to this particular consignment, we would then add details for that carrier EORI. If this consignment contains controlled goods, either one of the goods or many, then you would select yes here. In this example, we're not going to look at controlled goods. That will be covered in a separate recording. Navigating down the page, we've got some additional fields that we have on here. So the transport document type, because this consignment has not yet been linked to that ENS movement record, then it won't be pre-populated. So you do need to select the transport document type from this option and add the associated transport document number. You would then add the goods description, the consignor EORI, consignee, importer and exporter, and then save the form. I'm now going to look at one that's already been completed and go through those next steps in the process. If there are any questions relating to the fields on the form that you need further advice with, then please select the reference guide that's linked at the top of the page here. Once the details have been saved, if you do need to navigate back into that declaration to make any further amendments or to add the associated goods to that consignment, then navigate back into the declaration section in the banner here. When the page opens, you'll have visibility of the ENS declarations by movement. As this particular consignment hasn't yet been linked to that ENS movement record, then we need to navigate into the ENS declarations by consignment to view the records that have been created. And selecting either the all ENS consignments or draft ENS consignments. This will present back all of those consignments that are currently in a draft state. Where the client job number is missing, that means those consignments have yet to be linked to an ENS movement record. To make further amendments to the record, then select the unique reference number for that consignment. In this example, we've actually gone through and added all the details already. So we have all the information relating to the consignor, consignee, importer and exporter. And if I navigate down the page, you'll see here we've got a number of goods that have been linked to this particular consignment. Now, once all of those goods have been added for this particular consignment, you would navigate back up to the top of the page. And if you were the carrier or haulier that was transporting these goods, you would add the reference number for your carrier or haulier EORI into the carrier EORI field here. Once saved, that will send an email notification through to the person that's raised the declaration and also the associated carrier or haulier if it is a different party. And they will be able to link this consignment to that goods movement record prior to moving those goods. So I've now updated the screen, so I'm logged in effectively as the carrier or haulier that was associated to that previous consignment. And we're going to navigate into the entry summary declaration movement record itself and associate that consignment to this movement record. The haulier or carrier would navigate down to the bottom of the page here and select the Associate Consignments button. And this will present back to them any consignments that are linked to their organisation. So where the carrier EORI reference number has actually been added to that consignment. Selecting the consignments, we'll go through and search those particular consignments that have actually been linked to that organisation. And I'm going to add this particular consignment that we have just been looking at. You can add multiple consignments to this particular entry summary movement record by selecting and clicking again and selecting any other associated consignments that are linked to that particular haulier or carrier. Once that consignment's been added, you can then select the submit button and that will then submit and link the consignment to that entry summary movement record. If the carrier or haulier needed to make an amendment for that particular movement so that those goods didn't actually fit specifically on the lorry that they were using, as an example, then they have the ability to go through and decouple that consignment from that particular movement and move it into another entry summary movement record. They would navigate down to the bottom of the page and actually select the consignment that was linked to this particular entry summary movement. And at the consignment level, they would navigate to the bottom of the page and then select decouple from header. So that will remove the association of the consignment to that entry summary movement record. And they can then go through and add this particular consignment to another entry summary movement for another vehicle. This gives flexibility, which it does enable a haulier or carrier to make sure that those consignments that are actually aligned to them can be adjusted, or to enable multiple consignments to be linked to a particular movement record easily from a groupage perspective. Once the associated consignment is then linked, they would then go through and select the submit button when they were ready to go through into the next step in the process. And to navigate back, they would select either home here or the Trader Support Service logo. In this view, I'm actually logged back in as the company that created the consignment. And if I now go through and have a look at my E&S declarations by consignment, you'll see the declaration that we've just linked to that entry summary movement record has now been added, and we've got the client job reference number there. If you are the carrier or haulier that's created that entry summary movement record, then you have visibility of the record. If you are the organisation that has created the consignment details, but have actually asked that haulier or carrier to manage that movement on your behalf, then you have visibility of the reference number here in the client job reference number, but you won't have visibility of that E&S reference number if you go through and navigate into E&S declarations by movement.
Thanks, Sonali. Can we get back to the slide deck?
Yeah.
Seamlessly. That video is available on the user guide portal on the TSS system. So if you didn't take all that in, because there's quite a lot to take in, then you can just link. So you've got Northern Eye Customs Trader Academy, but it's a link from the main screen of the Trader Registration Trader Support Service portal. You'll see it as a user guide. Just click on that link and you can navigate to that. So the next section, just wanted to talk about simplified frontier declarations for SPS and control goods. Last week, we introduced some more functionality on the TSS platform. So prior to last week, the data that was entered into the TSS system for the simplified frontier declarations was a very much simplified data set. And we're holding those records within the TSS system. We're now expanding that data set, asking for more information for, in particular for SPS, which is plant and animal products, and control goods. And that will enable us to pass those records into the CDS system. So it's a gradual phasing in terms of introducing more information into the system. So if we go to the next slide, so in addition to what you've already been doing for the simplified frontier declarations, they'll now ask you for some additional information, such as if they are control goods and SPS goods, they'll ask you for documentary evidence and references. So, for example, if you're moving plant and animal products, you will have raised a CHED form, a Common Health Entry document, which has a number, and that goes onto the traces system. And that number needs to go into the declaration so that it confirms that you have complied with the health and safety standards and checks. We mentioned that notification for when you're raising those forms needs to be 24 hours in advance of the movement. So that's the guidance from both DEFRA and DERA on there. Also been asked to point out that please pay particular attention when you're keying those reference numbers in to make sure that they're consistent, the ones that you're using on traces and the ones that you put into the declaration system, TSS, because they will be matched up and checked by the Port Health authorities and DERA. So on the next slide, we'll just talk a little bit about what that looks like. So if you're moving goods, SPS goods in this example, in terms of roles and responsibilities, the seller and the buyer on there, so the organization that's selling the goods, they will have to arrange for the export health certificate to be completed, which is typically a veterinary inspection, and they'll issue a document that says it's compliant. That export health certificate number needs to go on the CHED form, which is raised on the traces system, and it's typically the buyer. If we're doing an import from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, it will be the buyer that raises the CHED, the Common Health Entry Declaration. They will need information from the seller. They may have an agent do that for them, but it's the responsibility of the buyer, the purchaser, to raise the CHED form on the traces system. As I mentioned before, the health certificate number goes on there, and they need to match up. And then depending on the agreement between the buyer and the seller and the Incoterms used, there'll be import declarations. So somebody will be responsible for raising the frontier declarations required to move those goods. And on the next page, we have a very simple diagram of how it all works. Now, I don't propose to go through this. This will be on the slide deck for you, but we wanted to mention this because there is a flow, a couple of points to raise on this. So on the left-hand side in blue, you've got the organisations involved in the process of moving SPS goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, or indeed it could be a typical movement between GB or UK and the EU. So in the green boxes there, the government systems, you can see there's a number of different systems that are used and operable. And just below that, we've got the TSS systems in blue, in light blue, where we're raising the declarations for you in the government system. So we're only a part of that end-to-end process. So please be aware of the need to actually raise the declarations before you're doing the TSS declarations in the middle there. So I won't go through this in the interest of time, but if there's any questions or people do want to go into this in detail, then we can do that as part of the questions. But once again, the request from our friends in DERA and DEFRA is to really stress the need to make sure that you do complete the TED forms early, as much notification as possible, as in 24 hours if possible, and make sure that the entry of those reference numbers on the declaration systems are consistent as well, so that we're not getting any issues at the declaration level. I was about to press next slide, please. So we've got another video which brings that to life. So in terms of how the declaration, the Simplified Frontier Declaration, is now raised on the TSS platform for SPS goods or control goods, we'll show you what that looks like. Again, this video is available on the NICTA website. We'll show it now so that you get an overview of it, and people can ask questions, obviously, in terms of the content, the general content.
Great, thanks, Frank. Let me just zoom in a bit again.
Welcome to this overview of the Trader Support Service and how to create a declaration that contains controlled goods. Navigating down the page takes us through to the section where we can start a declaration. And we now have two options. We can start at the entry summary movement record level and then go on to create the consignment and the associated goods that link to that consignment. Or you can select the entry summary declaration at the consignment level to enter the consignment details and the goods, which will then be linked to an entry summary movement record by the haulier or carrier. And there's a separate recording for that topic. Navigating into the entry summary declaration will take us to that entry summary movement, and then we can then add the associated consignment details and the goods details. So rather than creating a new record, we're going to navigate into an existing record. To open an existing record, you can navigate into declarations in the banner here. That will open up all of the ENS declarations at the movement record level first. And I'm just going to have a look at an example draft today. I'm going to use this example to have a look at the key information that's required when we are moving controlled goods. On the entry summary movement record, there has been an additional field that has been added to that record. So we have carrier EORI and we also have now haulier EORI. I'm going to navigate down to the bottom of the page and open up the actual consignment level and have a look at the key data for goods that are actually controlled. If you need further guidance for any of the fields that are on the form here, then please do refer to the guide, which is available via the link in the top of the page here. Where controlled goods are linked to a consignment and yes is selected here, then additional fields are added to the form. The first is the goods domestic status. This does default to NIDOM, but can be adjusted as required. The customs warehouse identifier, and depending on the procedures for that particular control good, if you are required to provide a supervising customs office, then use the selection box here to select the associated customs office. The declaration unique consignment reference number, then that will be added by the TSS systems. However, you may be requested to add it in manually. Navigating down to the goods section, then as we go through and have a look at the particular goods that have been added to this particular consignment, selecting new will take us into a new form to add an additional good to be linked to this consignment. Here are some examples where we've actually gone through and added some goods already to this particular consignment. When yes is selected at the consignment level, this question will be presented at the goods level as well, just in case there are mixed goods that are actually linked to that particular consignment. Add all the details relating to the goods information as we've done before, and for further information, do use the guide that is accessible by selecting the link at the top of the page. Navigating down the page, there will be some additional fields that are pertinent to those control goods. There's a section for procedure codes, so the procedure code and the additional procedure code are visible to you here. You can specify which type of control goods are being carried in this consignment using the drop-down list. In this example, we're using apples and pears, so we're using fruit and vegetables, and these are the selection options that are available to you.
Thanks, Jen. We've got the video is around about 11 minutes, but in the interest of time, what we thought we'd do is just give you a short intro to that and show you the video is there. There's also a detailed user guide on the new Simplified Frontier fields and requirements, etc. So do refer to both of those when you're raising your next declarations. It particularly applies if you're referring to controlled goods or SPS goods that are plant and animal origin. So do refer to that one, but we'll, in the interest of time, we'll move on from the video because that can be watched separately.
And
so perhaps
if we can just, before we go on to supplementary declarations, if I can just raise a couple of points that are incredibly important, and we really want you to bear these in mind as we go forward. The Simplified Frontier Declaration for SPS controlled goods, those of you who are SPS traders, i.e. goods of animal origin or plants. The release came out around about February the 15th. We did secure for you a sort of 2-week period of sort of trialing where we can work with you. TSS will work with you to make sure that you've got the right information and that you've done the relevant traces registration. But that period expires on February the 28th, which is in 6 days. And at that point, they really need to be compliant, because the danger, going back to the early part of the presentation, is that if there isn't an SFD with all this information in it, then a movement reference number will not be generated for the consignment. And if an MRN is not generated, that means that no GMR can be generated for the truck, and that means the truck cannot get through the ferry terminal. So it's incredibly important that the appropriate registration, the traces registration, is done in advance. And traces registrations are required regardless of whether you're on the supermarket easement or the authorized trader scheme, which is trusted suppliers of supermarkets. And of course, it also applies to anyone who's trading SPS goods who's outside of those easements. So it's really important that all of this is done. If you have any issues, if you're a SPS trader and if you have any issues with this, please get in touch with the contact center immediately. They are making a number of outbound calls to traders in this area, but please get in touch. Make sure you've got everything in place so that you can not experience a problem on the 1st of March.
Thank you, Shanker. So if we look at the third section, which is the supplementary declaration process. So last week we launched three main changes. The first one being the groupage that we talked about, which is the consignment first. The second one being the enhancement of the Simplified Frontier Declaration for plant and animal origin and control goods. And the third one is we've launched the first phase of the supplementary declarations. So a little bit of context, and then we'll do another video of the what the supplementary declaration looks like in terms of how to process that on the system. So this is an overview of the TSS declaration process again. So we go left to right after you've registered, submitted your information for your particular consignment of goods and the journey. We create at the bottom there the entry summary declaration and the Simplified Frontier Declaration. The goods are transported and they arrive at their destination in Northern Ireland. We use the GVMS record, which says, essentially the GVMS system says this vehicle has arrived in Liverpool and it's exiting to Belfast. And we use that to then trigger the declaration request for the supplementary declaration. So the EORI number that is down on the Simplified Frontier Declaration as the importer, so there's a field called importer on that system and that declaration. whoever is the EORI number on that field will receive an email saying you now have goods have arrived. Can you please complete the associated supplementary declaration for those goods? And that needs to be completed by the 4th of the month. So depending on when the goods arrive, you'll have a number of days to complete that. And on the next page, I think, very high level, so we've just talked about that one. Next page, please. So very high level, the steps to bear in mind now, because the supplementary declarations are becoming due for some of you. So in terms of preparations, keep records of the goods that you've received if you are the declarant. So if you're on anything other than delivered duty paid Incoterms, then it'll be the importer who's responsible for the supplementary declaration. So what we've heard from a few organizations is they're not quite sure sometimes what supplementary declaration goes with which Simplified Frontier declaration. So keep a track of the declarations that have been raised for you or for your organization, so that you can find the right Simplified Frontier declaration that's assigned to that supplementary. You obviously need to keep records so that you can complete that supplementary declaration. So make sure you've got your records up to date for the deliveries you've had in terms of the goods themselves, the values, and make sure you've got the right, on the second point, the commodity codes and any other codes and items that are needed to complete that declaration. So please don't wait for the date to arrive and then start searching that information. It's stuff that you need to prepare for now. And again, there are guides on the NICTA site. It says click here for the guide to look at the data and the type of items that are needed to complete a supplementary declaration. And step number 3 there, if you're depending on the origin of the goods, determine if they are qualifying for 0 preferential tariff under the trade agreement with the EU. If you believe they do, then obviously they enter without a tariff. And on number 4, if you meet the right circumstances, please apply for the UK trader scheme if you haven't already, because then your goods, it's an easier process in terms of importing those goods and the documentation that's required. So your goods are classed as not at risk, and you have less information required to fill out those declarations. One thing to mention there, though, even if you are on the UK trader scheme and your goods are not at risk, you still do need to complete the supplementary declaration. And finally, number 5, if you can't qualify for the UK trader scheme and your goods are at risk, then you can look at the waiver that you can claim, and that we've got down there. The threshold on that is up to 200,000 euros, subject to what are called de minimis thresholds. So in package sizes, up to 200,000 euros over 3 years. And we'll come back to the that process a bit later on. So how does this process work? So it's kind of a month by month process. On the left hand side there, in the first month, your month 1, for example, you're buying and delivering the goods themselves and raising the declarations. So in month 1, any declarations that are delivered, any goods that have arrived, they are due in terms of the supplementary declaration, are due on the 4th of that following working month. So March the 4th will be our next due date for supplementary declarations. And on the next slide, I believe we've got another video. There we go. So how long is this video, Shen, this particular one?
Yeah, I was going to say maybe it's not worth flashing this one up. This is the longer webinar version.
Ah, okay. This is too long. So rather than going through this one, there's a lot of information on the TSS user guide platform, both a document that talks about what fields needed to fill in the supplementary declaration. There's also a video which is as you saw previously, a step-by-step guide. This is quite a long one, so we probably won't go through this one, but definitely look at this one before you start producing your supplementary declaration.
Yeah, and there will be a shorter version up, I think, in the next day or two as well.
Yeah.
So just to help people, if you do visit the NICTA site, there's loads and loads of options. So if you just scroll to here, if you go to resources, there's a number of user guides. You've got the trade guides, which are more like overviews. And then if you go down to webinars, you have every webinar that we've done since October. So we do recommend it. And I'll make sure that all the links are also in the deck. Sorry,
more content than Netflix on there.
Yeah.
I think the final slides we have are around the rules of origin and at-risk process. I'm wondering, Shanker, is it worth just going through the steps on those?
Oh,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so essentially, and the first thing I'd say on this is the UK trader scheme, which Frank mentioned. We're relatively surprised by there isn't as much take up of it as we think there should be, based on the sort of nature of traders and the nature of trade between GB and NI. So if you can qualify, and we'll talk about what that means, if you can qualify for the UK trader scheme and be therefore a not at risk trader, which means that you're trading from GB to NI, part of the single customs territory, you don't need to worry about the UK EU agreement, doesn't apply to you. You don't need to worry about the rules of origin. And you can immediately have zero, there won't be a tariff that you'd have to pay. There is a deadline coming up, which is the end of February 28th. You have to have registered with the UK trader scheme, and you will get a provisional authorization, which is good for 4 months. And at that point, after 4 months, there will be an actual evaluation from HMRC as to whether you qualify for the UK trader scheme, but there won't be any retroactive change. So if you've provisionally been authorized for 4 months, no one's going to go back over that time and say, well, you should have been paying this tariff or not. And because of the nature of the rules of the UK EU TCA, it is absolutely critical that you register and you become provisionally authorized if you can, so that you don't have these concerns. It is not true, and I think there was some suggestion of this previously, that because there was a deal done between the UK and the EU for zero tariffs and zero quotas, that no one needs to worry about tariffs anymore. That's not true. There are rules of origin that apply to the trade agreement, just as apply to all trade agreements, and you only get the preferential rate if you satisfy the rules of origin. And if you don't, then you have to pay the European Common External Tariff for goods going from GB to Northern Ireland, and then you'll have to worry about whether you can get that back, whether you use the subsidy or the waiver, and you don't need to be in that category if you're in the UK trader scheme. So I'm going to come back to the UK trader scheme, but absolutely top of mind, February 28th deadline, need to apply for it. It's very straightforward and easy to apply for. So we strongly recommend people do that. So when you're about to do your supplementary declaration, you need to have a strategy. You need to think about, well, what tariff am I going to is going to apply to me? And the way you would look at this is you'd say, first of all, the first check is the European duty rate, the European Common External Tariff, is it zero? If the European Common External Tariff is zero, then your goods are always not at risk. That's because there is no risk from a fiscal perspective for the EU of goods entering Northern Ireland going onto the EU, because they wouldn't be paying a tariff anyway, so there's no reason for a tariff to apply. If the answer to that question is no, and for the most part it will be no, there are comparatively few products where the European Common External Tariff is zero, then you ask, are you authorized on the UK trader scheme? There are certain criteria that you have to satisfy to be on the UK trader scheme. We've got a detailed webinar that again is available on the Northern Ireland Customs and Trade Academy website, that goes into the specific requirements that you need in order to be on the UK trader scheme. If you are on the UK trader scheme, if you're authorized, then you ask, is the good subject to a European trade defense measure? So, for example, obviously people are very aware of the steel safeguard action the European Union has taken in response to the US measures under national security. If the good is subject to EU trade defense measures, then you answer yes to that. You can't take the benefit of the UK trader scheme, and you would then go to potentially an at-risk situation with that good. If the answer to that is no, and you're not subject to trade defense measures, then the question becomes, does the good meet the commercial processing exceptions? So the way the UK trader scheme works is that you have to either, as I say, the European Common External Tariff is zero, or if there is a tariff, then when we're talking about GB to NI goods movements, this generally applies to things that aren't being commercially processed. If the goods are being commercially processed in Northern Ireland, there is a default to at risk unless you're in one of the exceptions. And those exceptions relate to very small traders, less than £500,000 a year in revenue, or commercial processing in very specific sectors, which could be things like food processing, construction, goods that are intended for the charitable sector, and so on. And again, all of that is laid out in our material. And we also have a tariff guide that is available on the Northern Ireland Customs and Trade Academy, which you should look at, which lays these out in great detail, these different different ways in which tariffs might or might not apply to you. This then, if the goods are in those exceptions, then your goods may be not at risk, provided you satisfy some of the other provisions. If we can, sorry, go back to the previous slide, because I'm talking about GBNI right now. And if they are not at risk, then you will pay. You will not have to pay a duty. If you are at risk, and you have a trader that is at risk, in the sort of pink or I guess lavender sort of box, if the trader is at risk, but you are either a small trader, so that 200,000 euro limit for the subsidy that would apply to you, which is the state aid limit, that would cover off all of your requirements. That's a 200,000 euro limit for 3 fiscal years. You could rely on the waiver, and you could end up not having to pay a duty because the subsidy would cover you. Similarly, if you don't have many movements from GB to NI, typically less than 10 per month, it may well be that this is the best option for you. Using the subsidy is the best option for you. So our suggestion is that if you are a very small trader, or if you are able to benefit from the subsidy because you don't really trade very much from GB to Northern Ireland, then it may be appropriate for you to go straight to this and not have to worry about the UK trader scheme and the rules of origin and so forth. And you would then have to pay the duty. Now, the EU duty is defined, suppose you have to pay the EU duty, that is defined by the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the TCA. And if you have to pay, if you are covered by the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement, then as we said before, that doesn't automatically mean zero tariffs, zero quotas. It means that you have to, you can claim that preferential rate provided you satisfy the rules of origin. And so you'd have to look at what exactly are the rules of origin in your particular sector. They do differ from sector to sector. Broadly speaking, they are typically, do I change tariff classification? Have I substantially transformed the product before it goes on to Northern Ireland? on an at-risk basis. But there are local content rules as well for certain product categories. So you'd want to look at that to make sure that you satisfy the rules of origin. If you are bringing products in from the EU, from outside the UK, it may well be that you're subject to the onward processing rule, which essentially means you have to have processed the good in the UK in GB in order to take advantage of the rules of origin with respect to the UK EU TCA. And if you're not doing that, if you're simply distributing, if you're simply moving the product directly into Northern Ireland, you may find yourself subject to a tariff in this category. And the only way to avoid that situation is to use special customs procedures. So these will be things like warehousing or inward processing relief, other special customs procedures. So that's the overview. As I say, we have a detailed tariff guide on this, and we have a detailed presentation on this, which we certainly ask you to look at and digest before you decide, which of these options you're going to avail yourself of. But if you want to avail yourself of the UK Trader Scheme, really important to make sure you register for that before the February 28th deadline. And if we go to the next slide. So this is the rest of the world. So I was just talking about GB to NI. It's a very similar kind of decision tree, if you will, for rest of world to NI. So again, you'd ask yourself, is there an EU zero duty or not? There is a question additionally for rest of world to Northern Ireland, which is if the EU duty is more than 3% higher than the UK duty. In other words, the goods are coming into Northern Ireland, and the EU common external tariff is more than 3% higher than the UK duty, the UK global tariff. You will find that will be a default to at risk. So you'll have to use at risk in that category. If the EU duty is lower than the UK duty, that's just the first box there, then it will be an at-risk. It will be an at-risk movement, provided that you've covered all the other requirements, such as having a Northern Ireland facing a Northern Ireland facility, such as selling to consumer-facing trade. In other words, you're not selling into a generalized distribution center, which could go anywhere. And all those other requirements, including the requisite control that you have to demonstrate for the UK Trader Scheme to apply to you. Then the question, if that's no, then the question is, does the trader have UK Trader Scheme authorization? And then is the EU duty within that 3% band? If the answer to that is yes, you do have UK Trader Scheme authorization, and the EU duty is within 3% of the UK duty, then you ask the question, is the good subject to EU trade defence measures? If the answer to that is no, are you subject to commercial processing exemptions, much as we discussed before? Do the goods meet the end use criteria? So these are things like, is it being sold to consumer facing? Do you have a Northern Ireland facility? Those kinds of questions. If the answer to those questions is yes, then your goods are not at risk, and you can pay. And what you would do then is you would end up paying the UK duty. So you're always going to have to pay a duty. It's coming into Northern Ireland from the rest of the world. It'll pay the UK global tariff, the UK duty. If the answers to those questions are no, or if the goods are subject to EU trade defence measures, then it's going to be a European Common External Tariff. Now, if you paid the European Common External Tariff, then the question then becomes, well, are you able to use waivers or some other mechanisms if they are at risk? So the essential point here is you're going to have to decide whether the European tariff applies to you, the Common External Tariff applies to you, or whether the UK tariff applies to you. And again, the UK trader scheme is crucial here as well, because if you can declare that your goods are not at risk, provided they meet all of these authorization requirements, then they can be sold into Northern Ireland, and you can pay the UK global tariff, and there's no additional tariff test that you'd have to make, that you'd have to satisfy. So again, if you're importing from rest of world into Northern Ireland, you need to think about these considerations. If you're moving goods from GB to Northern Ireland, you'd have to think of the criteria in the slide that we just showed you before. And if we go to the next slide. So again, just to summarize, the 4 checks you need to perform now if you're getting ready to do your supplementary declaration. What's the European Common External Tariff? If it's 0, then you would not have a tariff to pay anyway, so you don't have to worry about that. If you are on the UK trader scheme, you can declare your goods not at risk. So you have to check the eligibility criteria for the UK trader scheme, which are primarily a consumer-facing facility, selling into a consumer-facing facility, having a Northern Ireland facility, and it has to be a real facility, and of course, if you are commercially processing, you can still benefit from the UK trader scheme, provided you fall into one of those exceptions to the general rule that if you're commercially processing, the goods will default to at risk. If you don't qualify for the UK trader scheme, if the EU Common External Tariff is not 0, then you are going to have to check the UK-EU TCA to determine whether you satisfy rules of origin and whether you can therefore claim the 0 tariff, 0 quota preferential rate in the UK-EU TCA. If you don't fall into any of those categories, or if you're a very, very small trader and you don't need to go through the process of analysing rules of origin, or it wouldn't make sense to have you do that, then you can claim the duty waiver, the subsidy, and you provided you fall within that de minimis £200,000 for 3 fiscal year amount. If none of that applies, then your goods are at risk and you will be subject to the European Common External Tariff unless you use special customs procedures such as inward processing, customs warehousing, temporary storage facilities, and so on. So you have to check those things if those 4 checks are all negative. So if we go to the next slide, please. So there's information that we've mentioned that a lot of this is available on the Northern Ireland Customs Trade Academy website. There are tariff guides, there are guides, user guides, and there are also all the videos that we showed you, plus the webinars that deal with each of these specific areas. So I wanted to just give you a quick thumbnail sketch of all of those different areas. I know that's a lot of information to take in, but if you go to the Northern Ireland Customs Trade Academy website, you'll be able to look at all of these things at your leisure, and these areas are the key ones for you to understand right now. I think that's the end of the presentation. Yes, that is the end of the presentation. So now I know we're tight on time, but happy to take a couple of questions at least. And if there are questions that we don't get to, we do answer all of them, and we'll send that out via Stephen.
Shanker, thanks for that, Frank, as well. Yeah, we have quite a lot of questions. People at this point in time are generally very exercised about the supplementary declaration process, because you've started emailing people and they know it's a requirement by the 4th of next month. So a lot of the questions that we have for you, both in advance that were received and in the Q&A today, relate to that. I'll start with the first one. Supplementary declarations, what detail is required for clearances? So I think there's about 23 separate fields at this point in time. Is that correct? Can you just give us I'm sure it's covered in the videos, but for now, can you give us a quick overview in terms of the types of things, the types of information that people will be asked to provide?
Yeah. To excuse me. You're right, Stephen. There is a guide in terms of the data guide, which actually tells you what fields are required. But in a very high level, you'll need commodity codes. So if they were already commodity procedure codes, common procedure codes. So we're only dealing with one procedure code at the moment. So that defaults to something called 4000, which is entering into pre-circulation. Then if you there'll be items relating to those commodities such as pricing, weights, and details around the commercial, if you like, the pricing structure of those items that you've moved in, and then other areas to be aware of are things like any documentation. So confirming things like licenses. Well, actually, it'll be only for the SPS goods. There'll be CHEDs, which if you haven't already entered in the simplified declaration, you'll need to enter it in the supplementary. So those are the key ones, really.
And
just to your point, Stephen, it's important for people to understand that these are not TSS requirements; these are legal requirements, and the only counterfactual here, the only alternative to the SFD subdec process is a single declaration on which all of this information would be required, and that declaration would have to be done before you even cross the frontier, before you go from GB to NI. It was our view that that would be a really difficult process, which obviously has been borne out by the reality of the subdec process, and that we needed to get people across the frontier as easily as possible. So that's the reason why this is happening this way.
Yeah, and those people who may be traveling goods from GB to NI via Dublin, for instance, will have experienced that full frontier declaration being required in some of the stresses. One of the reasons why people have moved to travel via ports in Northern Ireland rather than Dublin up until now. One of the critical elements of it is this kind of process of valuation, so an actual value of the goods that are traveling. And, obviously, there's a couple of different methods for that, which I'm sure you outline in your presentations on your webinars. But a couple of specific things just about goods that are hired. What valuation method would be required for those? So specifically, our question around the hiring of like cartons and those sort of things to bring goods forward and back. And then secondly, people moving goods from within their own business. So from one part of their business to another part of their business. So they may have a subsidiary or part of their process in GB that they're moving goods to Northern Ireland and back to GB. Is there a quick guide in terms of valuing those goods that may be hired? So do they use a higher value or do they use a capital value? Or and secondly, those that are moving goods within their own business from one plant to another.
Yeah, so in terms of own use, and that's sort of very specific to individuals, there is guidance that we can make available on own use and reliefs in the or at least the approach to customs declarations for goods which are moving in your own use, where you don't need to do the declaration in the sort of way that we've outlined. It can be done by quotes and other means. So that's an easier process, and we can send you some information about that. Also, for returns, just bear in mind that you do also have return goods relief. So if you're doing returns, you should look at the guidance that we've issued on return goods relief, and also HMRC gov.uk. There's guidance on return goods relief. So I'd say those things ahead of the valuation piece. But Frank, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, the current version of supplementary declarations will only let you create a supplementary declaration for something that's going into pre-circulation. So if you're bringing it in and taking it back again, or it's a temporary admission, there are ways of doing that on declarations, but the current version of the supplementary declaration won't let you do that. So you won't be able to, under that circumstance, you won't be able to use the current version of the supplementary declaration. But as Shanker mentioned, if you're bringing in packaging or cages, etc., then that can be done under a drop-down menu on the GVMS system, which allows you to bring in empty trailers with just packaging, etc. So you're doing this kind of a self-declaration at the border with that kind of approach.
And then the supplementary is not required at that point?
No, because there wouldn't have been a declaration in the first place if he's just using GVMS.
Good. How can we complete a supplementary declaration if the ENS and the SFD were not arranged by us, but the relevant supplier and haulier? So I'm assuming that's associated back to the XI EORI number. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So in that situation, if somebody's raised the carrier will raise the entry safety and security declaration, which is absolutely normal. That's what happens in normal situations. It's not a TSS thing. Then the supplier or the carrier may have also raised the Simplified Frontier declaration on your behalf. But as long as whoever is registered as the importer and that EORI number, they are the ones that will get the email. And that email will say, please complete the following declaration for the goods that you've received. So it will link you back to the Simplified Frontier declaration. You don't have to go find it. What you just need to be aware of is what was on that particular Simplified Frontier declaration. So some organizations will have a Simplified Frontier declaration that says T-shirts. I'm being a bit flippant there for effect. What T-shirts? If you had 4 consignments of T-shirts that week, you need to be aware of which T-shirts that declaration is referring to, which delivery. So that's an important one to look at. And for that, you'll need to organise with your haulier or your supplier. What are you using as a reference number? Are you using a shipping bill, an invoice, a transaction number from the haulier themselves in terms of their consignment number? But you'll need something to check that back. And again, it's not a TSS thing. It's not an automatic link. It's the way declarations work. So you could have 4 different consignments that week of T-shirts. You'll have 4 different declarations to do, and you won't know all of the detail just by looking at the list on the Simplified Frontier declaration. You'll need a reference point in that declaration that said, that was the consignment with 6 packs of T-shirts. That one was with 4 packs of T-shirts, and then you can create the supplementary. Hopefully that makes sense, Stephen.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it makes sense to me.
An elaborate description there, but I was just stressing that one because already we're getting feedback from people saying, well, I don't know what consignment that declaration was for. And the important thing is to think about how you will reconcile what number are you using. Consignment number, invoice number, waybill, it can be a whole range of things, but you need to just think about how you link those to your deliveries. Okay,
sounds very straightforward to me, but thankfully I'm not doing any of these. A couple of questions here. One around they were told to log in, but when they log in, they can't find any records. And then secondly, is there a step-by-step process? I'll take the 2 of those together. I'm assuming that those people should really contact one of those tiered levels of TSS support that's available both online and by contacting you direct.
Yeah, the first point of call is the contact center, and you raise a case. They are responding very quickly. If you get stuck, then you know where I live. I mean, that's a brave thing to say, isn't it? But I did have organizations saying, I've tried and I've got a couple of questions. So some of the more complex questions, what the contact center is doing is it will move the complex questions up to the tier 3. So where you've got a complex question, I'm doing this, but it's an inward processing relief and I want to re-export it duty-free, etc. What should I do? Bit of a complex question. It'll go up the chain quite quickly to tier 3. If it gets stuck, and there aren't that many, then a couple of organizations have reached out to me or go via, I was going to say go via Stephen. But more than happy to help in whatever way we can, but typically it'll go to the tier 3s. We're also lining up our tier 3s into sectors. So there are a couple of our guys that are facing into, for example, haulage and some manufacturing organizations. So where we're forming some of the relationships there, then they are helping out on a regular basis like that as well.
Okay, a couple of ones here. I'm conscious of the time. It'll take maybe 5 more minutes, but a couple of specific ones, and then the other questions we're gathering them behind the scenes here, and we're going to answer those for everyone that's out there. Is a processor the same as a manufacturer, Shanker?
Well, so the processor essentially is somebody who takes inputs from GB, and there's some sort of processing operation where a product is produced from those inputs. So if you're buying flour or wheat or other things from GB and you're making a product out of them, then you're a processor for those purposes. So you're going to be unable to, that's not going to be a not at risk movement unless you qualify for some of these exceptions. But having said it that way, please understand that the exceptions are quite broad. For example, they cover food, the entire food sector. They cover the construction sector. They cover all goods in the sort of charitable sector. So they are quite broad exceptions, and of course there's also this very small business sector. So the very small baker, for example, that gets some of their components from GB, if they're under 500,000 revenue a year, then they're not, they won't default to at risk. They could be not at risk, but they would have to satisfy the requirements for not at risk, which are, I've got a facility in Northern Ireland, I'm selling for retail, I'm selling to consumers, essentially, and so on. And I'd have to have sufficient control to make sure that I know where those products are coming from, and I know where they're going, more importantly, and I know that they're not going to Ireland.
I'll take one more question, but as I said, every question we've got we'll find an answer to, and everyone who's registered, so anybody who's online, we will email those answers with the recording and the slides to everyone, just so they're aware. But a lot of manufacturers bring in a lot of products, components, ingredients, raw materials, and they could run in a month. They could run to thousands and thousands of items. So to load all this stuff up on a product by product basis will be, there isn't enough hours in the day. So what's the process that TSS are able to provide there to assist with that bulk upload process that may be required for some of those manufacturers?
So if you're bringing in, you've got a lot of SKUs, or obviously this is supermarkets, and other people will be in this category. But if you've got a lot of stuff, a lot of products that are coming in, we do have a bulk upload API for the SFDs, so for the Simplified Frontier Declaration and the entry summary declaration. So if you think you're in that category, then please let us know. You certainly can call the contact center and say you're interested in the bulk upload API. There's a process that will get them into that process. Everyone will be asking about the bulk upload API for the Supplementary Declaration. That is coming, but we recognise that there is a big demand for it. But the best way to handle this is to first of all make sure that you're in the category where you need it, and then asked to be involved in our bulk upload API for SFDs.
It's actually published. The description and design of the API is published on the user guide again, but it won't be available until sometime in March as an upload bulk upload feature.
And will that require? So a lot of manufacturing businesses may have management systems linked to their accounts, linked to their ordering, linked to their logistics, etc., etc., etc. So I'm assuming that those ERP systems, MRP systems, etc., 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 may require some programming. Is that correct? So if people haven't had a look at it by now, they really should go and look at it and talk to their provider of that software then?
Absolutely, and that's why that information is there, even though the SupDec bulk upload API is not ready to use right now and is being tested and so on, or will be in testing. Is that we recognise there's a period of time people need in order to get their ERP systems and everything else. Essentially, want your tech systems to interface with our tech systems, and that does take work on both sides.
And just finally, the number of people saying that they're concerned that they don't have there's no requirement for their haulier to input a number that can then link back So up until this process, until now, that process hasn't been available to link the haulier to a number, so they can link it to the consignment that links it back into the supplementary declaration. Is there some consideration given to what should happen with those? Is there a route through for people that at this point in time are struggling to find that information and to be able to link those two documents together?
It's a tricky one. I think it's probably one for us to ask with HMRC. So in that scenario, you've had 4 consignments. I know what my total volume is, so I can declare the total volume, for example. I don't know which one relates to what supplementary declaration. Let me take that one away, Stephen. I'll answer that one because I'll need to. I mean, the logical thing is a flippant comment is as long as you've declared all of those consignments, then you're being a good citizen. But let me just get clearer guidance from HMRC on how that would work.
It's the old joke about having all the right notes, just not necessarily in the right order. Is that what you're saying?
I play musical instruments like that, yeah.
Okay, as I've said to everyone, we've gone kind of 10 minutes over our time already. Apologies for that. We've taken a note of all the questions. We have a recording. We'll get the slides from your colleagues as well. As we've done with all of these, we're going to share all that information after the event. We'll get the answers where possible directly from Frank, Shanker and colleagues at TSS. And if required, we'll get some answers from HMRC as well. There's a number of questions in there specifically around commodities like steel. We've done a lot of work on that. So if you haven't had word on it, then drop us an email directly and we'll respond directly to you as well. But can I just thank Frank, Shanker and colleagues for their presentation today. We'll share everything after the event and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers, everybody.